Not yet.
Well, thanks for coming to today's Brownbag. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me just tell you about a few things we've got upcoming. Later in the week, we've got a lecture that's going to be held over in Wesco called Memorialization of the Holocaust in Post-War Yugoslavia, and that's going to be at 4 p.m. in Wesco 3659. It's sponsored by organized by Department of Religious Studies, but we're co-sponsoring it. And then on Friday, November 4th, we're going to be showing Naputu on the Path in Bosnian with English subtitles, and that's going to be here at 7 o'clock. Marge, are you going to be introducing that for us? So, you're welcome to come. We'll have refreshments, and it's looks to be an interesting film. Our speaker today is Dr. Stephen Dickey. He is a professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. He teaches Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian language, as well as South Slavic literature and cultural history, Slavic linguistics. In fact, that's the topic of his, in part, topic of his lecture today on who tells you how to do things with simple words, Slavs, Performatives, and Germans.
Thank you. I hope you'll excuse me. I'm coming off of a long virus, and I still have a little bit of a frog in my throat, so hope you'll bear with me. I will just walk you through this PowerPoint. We're going to be talking about a kind of verb called performative. If you're allergic to linguistics, it's not very painful. And talk about the history of these verbs in Slavic, and we're going to bring the Germans into this. So, linguists tend to divide verbs up into various lexical types. We won't be concerned with this very much today, but we have verbs of consumption, for instance, eat, drink, verbs of creation, build, write, verbs of perception, see and vision, and on, other types, verbs of destruction, and so on and so forth. One very important lexical types of verbs in a given language is that of verbs of communication. And they always have, no matter what the language, they always have some special qualities. Okay? And these, as you might expect, say, tell, order, promise, and so on and so forth. Well, verbs of communication have, in recent decades, have been subject to a lot of scrutiny and study. A seminal work was by one J.L. Austin, who published a series of lectures in 1962 called How to Do Things with Words. I actually think this title is kind of hokey, but I included it in my title as well. Austin's point was that, and remember, he was coming out of the first half of the 20th century. People used to just think of language solely in terms of, does it accurately refer to states in the world or not? So if we say, the dog is in the doghouse, that is either true or false, right? And that was all language did, was either be true or false according to whether the content of the sentence matched, a state in the world. Well, what Austin pointed out was that we do things with language, and I think in this time, even if you're not a linguist, you've probably gotten this by osmosis. We get, people to do what we want by language. We make direct requests and commands. We make indirect requests and commands. I think there's a famous example where Stalin says, "Do it," and this is a signal for somebody to close the window. Okay, he wasn't really informing anyone that there was a draft, right? So one of the important ways we do things with verbs that does not involve truth or falsity, these are performative verbs and performative statements. Performative verbs instantiate or perform the action referred to by the verb as these verbs or statements are uttered. So I promise to be there at 8, all right? By saying that, we're doing what the verb refers to. Okay, this is a performative. Okay. Most often, not always, we can diagnose performatives by the appropriateness of hereby, again, in a given language. So you can say, I hereby promise to be there at 8, that's good. The doctor cannot meaningfully say, I hereby remove your appendix. You can check out, right? That doesn't work. So remove or remove appendixes is not a performative verb phrase. Well, Austin gets all the credit, okay, for discovering these verbs, when in fact Slavists had discovered them earlier. And this is a sore point with the Slavs, and there have been in fact a couple of Slavists who have almost made whole careers pointing this out. One was a Slovene, Stanislav Škrabec, who was really probably the first one to ever talk about these. And then Erwin Koschmieder, a German Slavist, and I'm still unclear whether he had any Slavic blood in him or not. It seems like he knew an awful lot of Polish to be a non-native speaker of Polish, but you can't get an article about Koschmieder on Wikipedia. Anyway, Škrabec and Koschmieder had already identified these, but they were concerned with an issue that arises in Slavic anytime we think about verbs, which is how do we express a sentence or an idea or whatever in terms of the verbal aspect category. Now, anyone who's had Slavic languages knows we have these perhaps irritating pairs of verbs, and you always have to make the choice. So Russian besides, not besides, so on and so forth. You can never quite get out of making the choice anytime you say something. So an issue in Slavic is, do we use perfective verbs when we make performative utterances, or do we use imperfective verbs? Well, the Slavic languages are uneven. Now let's take a couple of Slovene examples here that I just pulled off of the net. You can promise either imperfectively in Slovene, or you can promise perfectively in Slovene. Okay. I won't read all of these examples, and some of these examples are in older, a lot of these are in older languages, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense. But these, now, these are both present tense forms. If you've only had Russian, do not be misled into thinking that oblubim, which is the equivalent, the aspectual equivalent of Russian пообещаю, do not be misled into thinking that this means I will promise. Okay? Because this is how Slovenes on the street say it. Okay, I promise that I'll reduce the demands. Okay, other Slavic languages allow both too. Since Koschmieder worked primarily on Polish, I got some Polish examples here. Here we have an imperfective example in Polish. I won't read it. I admit that I wasn't right, or I admit I wasn't right. And then one of Koschmieder's examples, your doubt is my doubt, and I even admit to you, or confess to you, okay, tormented a nightmare. I'm not going to get into when you use one and when you use the other too much here. I'll come up with a generalization on the basis of some older language data, but I'm going to gloss over the contemporary state of affairs in these languages. Now, other languages strongly prefer the imperfective with various exceptions, and Russian is one of those. So ordinarily, you see I have the stress on the use, признаюсь мне, как питерцуй, and so forth. I admit, this is imperfective in Russian. One language that has no perfective performatives whatsoever is Bulgarian. They always, always, always use an imperfective verb. And I've chosen most of my examples here with admit. Okay? So we have an uneven state of affairs. We have some languages that allow perfectives fairly frequently, and other languages that discourage them. Here is a breakdown, and it's not an arbitrary breakdown. Languages that are on the western periphery of Slavic tend to allow perfective verbs in these statements to a relatively high degree. Okay. Now, the details in any given language with which ones allow it and which ones don't can get quite complicated. We're going to have to satisfy ourselves with just this kind of generalization in terms of relative degree of usage. Relatively low degree, or even absence of perfective performatives, are languages that are farther to the east. So we have Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, which has an important exception, which I will talk about here in a bit. And then East Slavic and Bulgarian and Macedonian. So we have an overall kind of east-west division here. Well, why would that be? That's kind of a puzzling question. I've spent a lot of time dealing with this subject, not with regard to performatives so much, but with other features of Slavic verbs. I won't go into that. But one thing we can do to try to figure out what's going on with this big division is go into older stages of the languages. Okay. And so let's go all the way back to the beginning. Well, a lot of times older texts don't have what we need if we're investigating some linguistic phenomenon. The older texts don't have much of that, especially when you're thinking about conversational phenomena. But religious texts tend to have a fair amount of performatives, and so we kind of hit pay dirt with all of the old Church Slavic religious texts. And we can see, I don't know whether you can see them very well, but I have these superscripts on every verb, I and P, for the aspect. Old Church Slavic has a lot of performatives that are imperfective. So when Jesus is on the cross, he commends, if you will, his spirit into the hands of God, and of course this is to give over in OCS. Or one that might not strike you immediately as a performative is when he tells somebody that their sins are forgiven. You know, your sins are literally released, okay? But this is eminently performative in the sense that by virtue of Jesus saying this, the sins are forgiven, okay? When he says it, it's done. He doesn't have to wait, you know, for processing time or anything like this, right? Okay. So we have and these are just a couple of sample examples. I mean, I can't deduce all of the relevant data here. There are also some perfectives in Old Church Slavic. And this is the episode where Jesus has a meal with a tax collector, and the tax collector is so moved that he says, you know, I give to the poor, and if I've half of my property to the poor, and if I've offended someone, I will, or been rather unfair to somebody, I will repay fourfold. It's interesting that these in the original text are present tense. Okay, so again, you should not be misled into thinking that these are futures. Okay, a la Russian, if you will. And if you go back here, this was our forgiving of the sins example, and this is from Zografensis. If we go to the Savina Kniga, in fact, we have the very same predicate in the perfective. So one version of the gospel, forgiving of the sins, is perfective. Another version of the gospel is imperfective. Well, what on earth is going on here? I think it's actually quite simple. If the performative is part of a ritual and or involves social or religious hierarchies, the imperfective is used. Okay? Well, that seems fairly unmotivated. What's going on, what's really going on here is if you have an addressee whose point of view and approval you have to take into account, you use the imperfective. So that, I mean, you know, for the sake of argument, Jesus just can't simply say he commends his spirit into the hands of the Lord. I mean, the Lord has a certain amount of accepting of the deal to do. Right? Everybody? Yeah. Whereas the tax collector has absolute control over his own resources. He can choose to spend them any way he likes. He can repay fourfold, 16-fold, whatever. So he controls, he's allocating his own resources and he controls them. And he makes momentaneous decisions that can be, if you will, expressed simultaneously to their making by perfective verbs. Okay? Now, the forgiving of the sins is kind of an interesting case because Jesus is, on the one hand, probably just an intermediary between God and the sinner, whereas you might also construe this as Jesus has control to forgive sins, and so he can just do it. Okay? The idea is being here that with a perfective performative, you know, we all know the associations of the perfective with completion, right? When we complete an event, it's perfected. So as you say it, you complete that event, and then bingo, you know, the imperfected, or sorry, the perfected is okay. So I think that the situation was in fact fairly simple by and large. There's some data that complicate this. We have some old Polish data that show perfectives in ritualistic situations, but not a lot of them. I think by and large this distinction was relevant. Now it doesn't mean, you know, we have millions of speakers even in prehistoric times. Not, you know, a given distinction might not have been relevant for all of them at all times and places. Now I would like to talk, I'd like to talk about some other contradictory data. And of course, some of the oldest Slavic texts are the Freising fragments, the Slovene fragments, and in religious texts here, in ritualistic context, we do have perfectives. Okay. We also have in all kinds of oaths from Old Slovene, we have perfectives. Now, there's something that becomes relevant here. They were translating these texts from different languages than OCS was translated. OCS was translated from Greek. Okay, these are being translated either from Latin or increasingly German. Okay, and this is something that I'm going to come back to. For now, I'll give you, we even have recorded a direct translation of a Middle High German oath. See, you know, I mean, the Slovenes were under control of the Germans, and the Germans were telling them what to do. Right? Well, to make this sure the Slovenes understood clearly what they were supposed to do, they had to translate this stuff into Slovene. Okay? So we have the original German here, and then we have the perfective performative. Okay? So this is one counterexample that arguably involves translation. Okay? Now we can come to the generous contribution of the Serbs and Croats to all of this data, and it's all, as things are down in the Balkans, fairly spicy. They have something which I don't know what to call other than abusive metonymical performatives. Okay? The most innocuous of these is up at the top. Okay? I spit on the woman that bore you, which is perfective. And if you learn BCS, you would think, well, it must be plurium. You know, if you're thinking, okay, next time I have to tell somebody this, it's going to be plurium, right? But in fact, they by and large say plurium. Interesting division. Serbs say plurium a little bit more. Now we have some highly obscene examples here, and I could lengthen this list ad nauseum. And we even have one from political commentary. I think this is kind of entertaining here. These are, in fact, very relevant. These are contemporary examples, but these are very relevant for the historical state of affairs because such utterances reflect very old curses. Okay? These are pagan things. Even if you know, something like this, maybe, I mean, I'm sure that they were saying things like this in 1000 AD, even if we don't have evidence of it. Okay. So these are very old curses, and these give us a window, if you think about it, into what the usage must have been. Now, we can, in fact, seamlessly integrate these into the distinction that I just mentioned with OCS. Because when you say these things to people, you are expressly disregarding any wish that, or preference that they could possibly have, right? You are in control of the rhetorical situation. Okay, did everybody follow this? You know, in general, obscenities, what do we do with obscenities? I mean, you know, if I, for instance, if I were giving this talk and all of a sudden I just started spouting obscenities, even if I wasn't personally offending people, you would all take it as an affront, right? You don't say these things in polite company. The reason you don't say them in polite company is because when you utter an obscenity, even if it's not metaphorically directed at that person, you force the person to have an objectionable thought. Okay? And these, such sentences are kind of the logarithm of that. You force them to have thoughts about, you know, various kinds of sexual or whatever physical abuse. Okay? Either to them or to their relatives, you know. I mean, we all know these examples, right? Okay? So these, in fact, reflect speaker control. Okay? Now, these exist in other Western languages, but they can be misdiagnosed. If we don't know, see, one of the interesting things here is that perfectives have a future in BCS. If you say, I will spit, it's plunuchu. Well, I won't do these others. Okay? All right? If you know, whereas you don't have that perfective future in Russian, you have a perfective present that acts as a future. Well, Czech doesn't have a perfective future. It has a perfective present that acts as a future. Czechs look at this and they say, oh, well, that's probably future. But in fact, it's present. And it's the same kind of relic. Okay? And this is a very entertaining example here, Lower Sorbian. Of course, all the Lower Sorbian informants, I guess, are on life support or something. Not many of them left. But this is, of course, an obscene root here. I mean, you all know, right? I mean, just as an aside, this jebać in Sorbian no longer has the obscene meaning, okay? Vujebać in Upper Sorbian is, in fact, despite, and is considered to be high style. So it's completely lost. So this is just the equivalent of, I spit on your money. This is not particularly obscene, okay, in present day usage. And so we have this stuff in the Western Rim. You can even get a little bit of it in Polish, but Polish is, again, getting to be more like Russian, where it doesn't like perfective performatives at all. Okay? Now let's go back in time, look at some more translations. We have translations in some of these Western languages from German, where we have perfective performatives. This is from Luther's, I think it's called the Small Catechism. Okay, and again, this is commending oneself. So poručić, all right. Now, why would Western Slavs be and go back here to remind you of this Slovene example. Why would Western Slavs be translating German prefix verbs with perfectives? Well, as they were either bilingual or just having in general to deal with German, they were trying to simplify things. They were doing what people do in situations of language contact. They were creating equivalencies. Okay, so German has tons of prefix verbs, just like Slavic. And these Western Slavs were taking German prefix verbs and making them making isomorphic equivalents. Either making new verbs or taking their old verbs and using them in ways that are basically equivalent to these. So there's no imperfectivizing suffix here. They're just making these equivalencies, and they have either in the catechism or in the oath, they see these prefix verbs, they say, okay, well, let's just translate this with this. I mean, it sounds rather primitive, but this is basically what was going on. And it's actually quite reasonable, because when you, in situations of bilingualism, people try to make things easy on themselves in one way or another, okay? In the end game. Slovene has lots of calques from German that are recognized as such. I won't read all of these here, and these are just some samples. They tend to be abstract verbs. Also, verbs of speaking. All of these, you know, most of these are, verbs that can be used as performatives in the situation. Okay, so you can decline something verbally. You can recant something. You can, you can leave something to somebody by word of mouth. Okay. And so it looks like, this seems like a very small amount of data, but the number of calques in Western Slavic languages that have been made on the basis of German is enormous. It's just that most of them aren't verbs of communication. And I mean, I could spend the next, all of my remaining time just even giving you a few samples of these other verbs. I think one that's quite interesting is podjakovat se, which is kind of high style in Czech, which is a calque of German sich bedanken. Now, how do we know that it's a calque? Because if we go back in Slavic and OCS, we don't have, well, first of all, this is a loan, ultimately. Diek, danken, right? Okay, but we don't have po with se with a verb of thanking, okay? We don't have this in Old Russian, we don't have this in OCS, and then, you know, voila, it crops up in a language that has had centuries of bilingualism with German. It's also in Czech, or sorry, Slovak here. This is from the early 20th century. Here's a very nice Slovak example from the 19th century. Okay. And this is from a translation of a German novel, a German romance novel. And, you know, a native speaker who saw this, I mean, I don't really know whether Slovaks still say this or not. This is rare in Czech today. A Slovak might say, well, this was a translation, this doesn't count, right? But this is precisely my point. They were translating stuff from German, okay, and they were making these equivalencies. A much more complicated case, so this is just an ordinary calque where we're creating these equivalencies, prefix, root, ending. There are verbs that originally existed in Slavic that were kind of realigned semantically in the Western languages to be equivalent to German verbs. German, from Middle High German, at the end of Old High German, Middle High German, geloben meant three things, three related things. To promise, to swear, and to marry, not in the sense of transitive marrying two people, but when you say, I betroth myself, okay, I promise to marry so-and-so, in this context. Well, so ubiti exists, at least in Old Russian. It's kind of curious it doesn't exist in OCS, or rather is not attested in OCS, and there's plenty of promising in OCS, by the way. So there may be something even going on with some language contact as far back as Old Russian. In any case, we have the usual suspects all have this verb in basically the same meanings, okay? Slubic, Slovovac, Slivic, Slibovat, and so on. These all, in the well, not in Polish, but in the other languages, they mean to promise or swear, and they have meant at times to marry, this betrothal meaning, and possibly like zaslibit in Czech has this meaning with an additional prefix. So here's some old examples. This is 19th century Polish example where somebody is promising to do something. Now it's, what is it, obiecać in contemporary Polish, right? They got rid of this. Of course, you have to wonder, why do you get rid of a verb of promising, right? Maybe because it's German and you don't like it. Okay. Czech. Now, Czech, you can find tons of examples of perfected performative promising in Czech, although speakers tend to claim that they won't say it, okay? But some misbehaving speakers do say it all the time on the internet. Okay. So, given the fact that this does not exist in Russian or any of these Eastern languages today outside of this compact Western area, the most likely, what is most likely occurred is that as these Western Slavs came in contact with the Germans, and they were having to promise, okay, all kinds of things, probably a lot more than they wanted to, right? They were modeling their verb of promise on the way the Germans were doing it, and the Germans were probably quite happy to dictate to them how they were supposed to promise, right? Moreover, they were having lots of marriages, right? Arranged marriages, so everybody's happy and getting along with each other, okay? Marriages between nobility. And so it really makes sense that these verbs would at times have also gained this meaning of marry, okay, if they're modeling things on German. Let's take another example. This is the second case. I guess I'm doing quite well for time. Have a little bit of time at the end to relate this back more to area studies. Poprositi has existed in all likelihood from the get-go in Slavic, you know, as the perfective of the request. Now we all know it in Russian, you know, quite familiar, poprosit, right? It doesn't exist in all Slavic languages today, but it has definitely existed in most of them, and the ones that don't have it probably got rid of it at one point. Well, so there's nothing particularly German about having this verb. What is suspicious is that in the Western language, the Western languages, Polish, Czech, Slovak, poprositi, reflexes of poprositi with the prefix o, okay, has come, these reflexes have come to express polite requests, just like German erbitten does. When you want to express a polite request in German, you can do it this way. Okay? And it's kind of a stilted way at this stage in German. And again, we have an equivalency. You know, I mean, I can only speculate that they're saying, okay, erbitten has a prefix, it has the root, meaning request, and it has its ending, and then it has this preposition. So let's take our verb, well, check prefix, check root, check ending, and then we've got all. Okay? Which means the same thing as right? Is around, o is around. And the use of o with the accusative is not terribly typical of Slavic languages, so I would suggest that o with the accusative is part of the calc, or part of maybe the construction of what you might call a phrasal calc here. Okay. In any case, Polish has used this quite frequently in the past. Poproszę o today is kind of archaic, which we would expect. Again, I mean, these are linguistic habits that are going by the wayside now, okay? There was a kind of Central European linguistic culture, and it has been, you know, had a lot of time to disappear, okay, since the Austro-Hungarian Empire went by the wayside. We also have this quite commonly today in Czech and Slovak. As far as I know, it is not archaic in Czech and Slovak, and you can get all the examples you want in Czech and Slovak, and I've picked examples where they are clear, where somebody says dobrý den, you know, this is a polite context, okay? You don't say good day to people, you know, that you're not kind of being polite to. And the same government, if you will, the Czechs and Slovaks take o, all right? And with the accusative for plus the accusative. So I would, again, to sum up, I would say that they've been doing this, the same thing has happened here that happened with slubiti. They've taken a verb they've already had, and they've modeled it according to a German verb and its particular nuance, okay, that they've come into contact with. Last but, and probably least, in fact, are loan verbs. You know, the Slavs have always known how to promise and how to do this and that, so we don't have that many loans. Now, I pointed to one earlier, Czech děkovat, right, which is to thank, or poděkovat se. But these tend to be atypical, I mean, are not common, where you just, you know, I mean, the Czechs must have known how to say thank you, right? They had to have. Why would they loan in German thank you? Okay. But maybe it was prestige. Okay. I mean, all kinds of things can enter into it. One particularly interesting loan that's in Czech and Slovak is to dare, when you dare to say something or do something. And this is from German sich trauen. And I'll just give you a Czech example here. You can find enough Slovak examples as well. Toto je trochu si tvrdit. Okay, so I dare say. All right. And of course, whoops. this is, you know, phonetically or whatever, this is wrong for German. Now, there is an imperfective Trauerfahrt, see. Why would they use the perfective here? That's kind of an interesting question, because there's no prefix, right? Two things speaking in the perfective's favor. One is that it's a momentary verb, so as soon as we say, you know, it lends itself to this perfective construal. I don't want to dwell on the next point too much, but there are indications that the Czechs and Slovaks have used note suffixation, which is the equivalent of Russian nut, because it sounds like the German N infinitive ending. Okay, they both have an N. Okay, and I won't go into the reasons why I think that, but this could be a part of that. Okay, so we even have some interesting loans, and these loans are well, the Slovak is also perfected here. These loans are showing this perfective performative usage. Okay, so let's go through some conclusions here and wrap things up. As I said before, there was an aspectual distinction in common Slavic performatives based on control. The perfective expressed speaker control, whereas the imperfective was used in contexts of social or religious hierarchies. Otherwise, although not exclusively, but by and large, perfective performatives crop up mostly in Western Slavic languages that have had great degrees of language contact with German. Now, the effect of German language contact on Slavic with regard to these performatives has not been one of radical change, because we do have some performatives from the get-go, okay, that are expressed with perfective verbs in Slavic languages. What I would suggest is that the main change is that it's likely that German language contact erased the control distinction. So that in Czech and Slovak, like with promising, there's no control distinction anymore in promising. You just anytime, or well, Slovene, well, that gets to be complicated because of official prescriptive tendencies and so on. But let's keep it simple here. That for people on the street, they can just use the perfective anytime they want, and there is a kind of rationale, because even though we could have a control distinction in our performatives, okay, to express the relevance of certain hierarchies, we all do, in some sense, to some degree, control our own utterances. So one way we could think about the German erasure, if you will, of the control distinction is it just that, well, it just made all or most performatives, you know, speaker control, okay? Because I mean, unless somebody's like, you know, pressing cigarettes into me or something, I mean, I choose whether I promise or not, right? Okay, I don't have to promise if I don't want to. So I would argue that this has been the change. Well, I skipped over this. And what's interesting about German language contact, and here I have a whole bunch of other things in mind as well, is that German language contact has not, on average, radically changed Western Slavic languages, say Czech, Slovak, Sorbian. Rather, by and large, and including these performatives, but all kinds of other things, it has preserved older structures. Slavic used to be, if you will, a lot more like German. And then Russian, East Slavic, and Bulgarian kind of went off on their own paths, okay, and had a lot of developments that are very atypical for European languages. So that we have basically this German language influence is what produces what linguists call convergence, where languages either become more similar or they remain similar when other languages change. Okay. And I think, yeah, those are the last of my conclusions. What I would like to point out here, I mean, you know, this is not a linguistics seminar. I think it's very interesting, you know, if you study Slavic, you know, the history of Slavic lands, you get in, you know, whether it's Bohemia and Moravia, or Poland for that matter, Slovenia, the former Yugoslav territories, these peoples have all been dominated by Germans for long periods of time. And so if we read our history books, we'll see, yeah, the Habsburgs were controlling all of, you know, their lives and their farming and this and that for centuries. And then if we go to, you know, learn the language in the classroom, and we also talk to the locals, these languages have been hermetically self-contained, you know, maintaining Slavic traditions irregardless of any outside influence. And it's simply not true. Rather, the linguistic history, you know, and we can look at this linguistic data, it's just like a fossil bed, and it shows you the exact same thing that social history books tell you, okay? In Bohemia and Moravia, centuries of German-dominated, centuries of German domination. Well, that includes also linguistic domination to a certain degree, and then these things crop up. And you can find them if, you know, I hate to say this, if you have an open mind and you know where to look. Now, you know, and I've talked to the locals of these countries a lot about this, and of course I've gotten, you know, various responses amounting to hesitation and disdain and so on. We can understand why, you know, they don't like this. I mean, the Slavs have always had kind of this love-hate relationship with the Germans, okay, in purely political and social senses. And of course, you know, all this leads up to World War II, and it's perfectly understandable that Slavic linguists weren't clamoring to show that large portions of the grammatical structure, you know, were imported from German in the decades after World War II, right? They had more than ever an allergy to things German, and that's completely understandable. But as time goes on, we should be able to recognize these things for what they are. And if Slovene or Czech has large amounts of German in it, it's no different than English having large amounts of French in it. Okay, the Normans came, you know, to England. You all know the story, right? They took over and then they were absorbed, and English absorbed Norman French wholesale. But you know, English is a Germanic language, right? So there's no reason to deny these things. In fact, I would argue that these phenomena make these languages and their peoples more interesting. I mean, if you go to Prague or if you go to Ljubljana, and then you go to Moscow, you know, only somebody who's blindfolded thinks, "Wow, I'm just in Slavic land," right? They're very different places. They're very different places, different cultures, and that German Slavic condominium, if you will, has of course played a large role in this. So I'll stop it there. If anybody has any burning questions, I'd be happy to.
I have two.
Okay.
Very quick. One about high style, the other about obscenities.